If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Outdoors enthusiasts and woods people, what's the strangest encounter you've experienced while hiking, camping, or in the woods? Have you ever faced disappearances or mysteries in the forest? I'm from remote Alaska. I grew up with stories of old creatures and legends, but I've also seen some things. My village is roughly 250 miles northwest of Fairbanks, Alaska. It is situated in the mountains and surrounded by a national park, so there is already suspicion of supernatural entities there. Growing up, I was always told about the little people. These smaller humanoids are of smaller proportions, but they are strong, fast, and very smart, and they even speak an old dialect of the language of the area they live in. At a distant point in time, we lived alongside them and hunted for and with them out on the Nuna, or tundra. But, as one family was visiting another, a human's dog ate the little one's child, and so began a grudge that some still hold today towards humans. There are stories of people being lured away from their homes just to be tricked and left out in the middle of nowhere. There are also stories of them helping us humans in times of need. Like in my village, caribou were herded by a small, blurry thing towards a group of people, according to a story from the 60s-70s, and there was a good harvest of animals that fell. There are also stories of the Inukpak, big person, sometimes called Bigfoot by people, even though they don't always look like an ape-like human. The old stories talk of giants that roam the land in silence or in anger. One story even tells of a cannibalistic one out west, near Nome or Kotzebue. Back home, they come around when the caribou do, like the Inullagarat, and will either be mischief or just watchful of humans. In my personal experience, I've seen the little ones and the big ones. They can both resemble humans or just be a blur on the land. I believe they're part of another world or dimension, and that's why they cannot always be seen, but hey, we may never know. I took the wrong turn when solo hiking and ended up exploring hidden ruins in Oahu, Hawaii. I heard drums banging in the distance, then I heard chanting and singing. I thought it was a tourist group. Then it got louder, and I saw torches in the woods, and a smell came from behind me that smelled like roadkill. I turned around and didn't see anything. Then the drums sounded like they came from behind. I turned around again and didn't see anything making the sound. I followed the drum sounds to their source. They originated in a specific spot in the middle of thin air. I heard a super loud horn or conch shell shortly after and got out. A few days later, while doing a hike with a group, I told the guide what happened. She said I bumped into Hawaiian ghosts named nightmarechers. I was confused. A month later, I learned that those ruins and the general area I was in were some of the most haunted areas on the island. I was hunting in Newfield State Forest. There's a very well-worn ATV trail that's not on any maps. I came across two other hunters, and the one guy told me that they had walked to a tree he liked and sat under it but didn't see anything, so I figured I'd follow their footsteps and see where they led. Nothing eventful happened, but I was by myself, and that's the deepest I walked into the forest, probably about 3 to 4 miles. I get following their footsteps, and they just didn't end. They never found the tree. That whole summer, all I did was watch spooky stories about forest monsters, so as I got way out of their way, my active imagination started thinking about how this was perfect Weddy territory. I had to briskly walk back closer to civilization. My thing is, pretty much everyone I've intimately known has had some type of odd experience. So if these things are in our houses, they have to be in the forest too. I go hiking a lot. Alone with the dog. Larch Mountain off trail gives me shivers. There are lots of spooky vibes there. It's the closest dark wooded area with a paved road to Portland. There have been lots of crazy shifts up there over the years. Like the lady with a facial deformity who lived in a cabin for decades. There is no contact with the outside world. Despite this, I regularly cut the road switchbacks and hike off the trail up there. But I've also been spooked at Wyeth. Something big is in the woods. It's near me. Just out of sight above the trail. Small noises at first, then big rocks coming down and shifting above. The thing is, it's a cliff face above. Imagine an elephant-sized thing on a mossy rock face. Not possible, right? The sounds follow me for a few minutes, and in another drainage, I hear them again. Keep in mind that no one ever hikes Wyeth. It's like the abandoned part of the gorge. Dog whimpers. We run back to the truck. Duck Wyeth. I've never been back. As some of you want to hear stories, here is what I can recall from my time in the wilderness. 1. Middle of the winter caribou hunt. In my high school years, I was an avid hunter and provider for my village. I hunted caribou, moose, Dall sheep, and even bears for my family and elders in my village. But some of these hunts can keep you on your toes, not only because of how stealthy you need to be or because of how dangerous some animals can be. 5 feet 9 inches 240 pounds at the time, have been flipped and tossed by caribou like a rag doll, but because you might have eyes on you at all times. This time, it was mid-December, and it was clear and cold. Nearly minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit with a slight wind chill of somewhere in the 50s, I set out to find some caribou to try and add some meat to my family's freezer. I left the village and drove for almost an hour before I came across a large patch of diamond willows near a place we call Ben Creek. There, I stopped and glassed around with my binoculars. While I was stopped, I could hear rustling in the willows beneath me, but I thought nothing of it. As the time passed and I continued to meticulously search the land with my binos, I heard my name called out. Though some people pass it off as a figment of my imagination, I swear I heard my name called out from the tiny willow forest beneath me. Something along the lines of "Hey." My name. It was as if a relative was calling for me. But there were no other people out there. I had taken the only snow machine trail into the valley, and the last tracks were blown over by the wind, so they had to be days old. As I started up my Ski-Doo snow machine, the willows snapping became louder, and I raced the HLL out of there. 2. A climber. Across the valley from the first story, my uncle had a few traps for wolverines that same year. The conibears are his favorites, so he was teaching me, 16 at the time, how to set them for wolverines. We were parked at one of his sets when I looked up into one of the small divots in the mountain and saw a tiny, dark figure climbing up an incredibly steep mountainside. I picked up my binoculars and looked up, and when I did, the thing took what looked like its cape and slung it over itself. It almost resembled the hide of a grizzly bear, but as it was like minus 30 at the time, it couldn't have been. I told my uncle, and when he looked, he got freaked out, so we left. Keep in mind that he has nearly 40 years of experience out in our homelands, and he doesn't even try to avoid bears on the trail. 3. One fall, August to September, my family left the village to go and pick blueberries and cloudberries. We were traveling east in an XTV called an Argo when we spotted what looked like a person in the willows across the valley. They were standing in the willows, which were about chest height for them, and waving like they needed help. So, as we are taught to do in remote Alaska, we turned and headed for them to see if they were in distress. Upon arriving at the willow patch, we realized the willows were like 8 feet tall and there were no vehicle tracks anywhere near it. On a rainy Halloween, I was kind of deep in the woods. It is about a 15-minute walk from an old, closed-off road used by lumberjacks years and years ago that leads to nothing. It was around 11 p.m., so it had been pitch black for hours. I had a fire going, and all of a sudden, 2 faces just appeared out of nowhere across the fire and asked if they could join me. It was a man and a woman, mid-30s, who said they wanted to make a fire and make some hot dogs but failed to make one due to the rain. They were nice people, and we talked for a couple of hours, but goddamn, I never let my guard down and had a knife ready all the time. They told me where they came from, and it must have already been pitch black and raining when they left home. Still, they had no flashlights or any other source of light, were not dressed for any kind of outdoor activity, and pretty much no way to make a fire. They just drove for 2 hours and then went miles up an old, overgrown road, stopped at a random place, and walked 15 minutes, maybe 30 minutes without a light, straight into the woods off trail. I just can't figure out why they were there or how they ended up there. Everything was so goddamn off about them. After they left and the fire went out, I relocated in the dark before going to bed. A guy and his wife decided to hike Mount Roberts in Juneau, Alaska. There are a few ways to get up there. You can take the public tram to almost the top and then make your way up a few hundred feet, or you can hike the entire thing. They got up early and decided to hike it. About halfway up, they were talking to another hiker who was in his 60s, who was telling them that he has hiked that mountain for decades and loves the trails. And he showed them a bench that is down towards the backside of the mountain. If you want, you can work your way down the little crevasse down the backside to that bench, and then it connects to the river, which goes around the mountain and back into town. That is more of a scenic adventure that takes you back. And they had been having a good time, so they decided to scale down the back of the mountain to that bench. And so the man and his wife are going down this side, and it is really rocky. They consider not doing it anymore, but it seems a little too rocky to climb back up where they came from. Also, they can see the bench and are getting closer to it, so they just keep going down. And 20 minutes pass, then 30 minutes, then an hour, and then more than an hour passes. No trails are emerging like they thought there would be. And they are not really liking this decision anymore, but they can see that bench down below. And then the man and his wife finally get a more clear view that between them and that bench is actually a huge drop-off. The canyon turns into a 200-foot drop, and then it is the low river bed with the bench. You can't get to the bench without dropping 200 feet. So they are in a lot of trouble. They end up turning around and going back up, and it is very hard. They end up getting cell reception eventually, and a team has to come and rescue them. They get into town the next morning. They go on radio shows and talk to everyone, but no one knows anything about that 60-year-old man. No one has ever heard of him. It is a small town, everyone knows everyone, and no one has heard of a man in his 60s who has hiked there for decades. So scary. What do you think about this? I was homeless for a few years, from 18 to 21, and I used to stay in a tent with my ex. I always had to end up moving my tent spot eventually because the cops would find us. Either way, I spent a lot of time in the woods at night. One night, when walking back to my tent, I heard something down the trail a bit. I shined my light in the direction of the sound to be met with glowing eyes reflecting my flashlight. However, where the eyes were made, whatever I was looking at was taller than me, and I'm 5 feet 8 inches. There is no animal that tall in my area. I turned to my ex and tell him to start going to the tent faster. He could tell something was off, so he asked if I was alright. I told him I'd tell him when we get to the tent, because I have always been told not to acknowledge such creatures or spirits as it gives them more power. Then some nights there would be smacking on our tent. It would hit all the sides of the tent. We would look out the tent windows and check outside the tent, but we would never find anything or hear any footsteps. Another night, during the summer, we decided to go for a small hike at night because it was way more of a tolerable temperature. About 15 minutes into the hike, I started feeling paranoid, like I was being watched. About 5 minutes later, I heard a maniacal laugh coming from somewhere in the woods. I couldn't pinpoint which direction, though. My ex asked what that was, and I loudly said, "I don't know, but whatever the duck it is, it needs to stop." As soon as I said this, multiple maniacal laughs started. My ex and I turned around and walked back for what felt like the longest 20 minutes. Another time I found a severed coyote head with something hung in the tree beside it that had a tooth in it. And lastly, one time I was with my friend parked on the road far into the woods, so we could smoke. The passenger window was down, which is where I was sitting. The woods were right next to me. Again, the feeling of being watched overwhelmed me. 2 minutes or so later, I hear a hello and then John? Coming from the woods. I told my friend to turn around, and we needed to leave. I didn't tell her why, because, like I said, I don't like to acknowledge these things until I'm far away from them. I've been camping and hiking my whole life. Sometimes in well-established areas. Sometimes in the deep woods, where one would have to hike in and hike back out. Areas with no cell service and no infrastructure within miles. As a young man, I didn't think anything about it being dangerous. I always assumed I was the only person around. On my last solo outing, I was in southeast Oklahoma, in and around the Ouachita Mountains National Forest. I had been there for a couple days and had not seen another soul the entire time. Then, I heard engines in the distance. Before long, 3 rock crawler 4x4s were cruising along, having fun. I had some lunch cooking, and I waved them down and asked if they wanted to join me. They did want to. And they were friendly enough. And grateful for the hot lunch. I was grateful for their company. So after a while, in normal conversation, one of them asked if I was out there alone. He just seemed curious, and I answered yes. They all commented that I was a little crazy for being alone. I didn't immediately understand why. I knew the area well and had plenty of supplies. After they left and I was alone again, I started thinking, what if they weren't friendly? What if their question about my solitude was malicious? How would I have answered? If I had lied and said no, they could have easily watched from a distance to confirm if I was truly alone or not. What would I do? I decided I would just have to leave if I felt troubled. My car was 10 or 15 miles away. Probably a hard, full day of hiking. I eventually decided I was being paranoid and ruining my experience. So I pushed it out of my mind and eventually went to bed. 20 or so minutes after laying down in my tent, which, as you can guess, offers very little protection or fortification. Maybe 50 feet north of my campsite, I heard a blood-curdling scream that sounded almost human. Then, in the moment, and now, I was pretty sure it was a wild cat. But the really creepy part was that, whatever it was, it only screamed once. Like a warning to me that it was there. I barely slept at all that night. The next day, I packed up and made my way back to my car. Nothing bad happened, and I was safe. But I'm not a young man anymore. And my risk assessment has changed as I have gotten older. And I have decided that camping by myself is too risky to do anymore. It might be an anticlimactic story. But it was enough to scare me out of the woods. I also got poison ivy on that trip and had an allergic reaction to its already toxic effects. Lessons learned. And I share the story to show that even experienced, knowledgeable people can be put into situations they don't know how to handle. And I hope someone can learn from me instead of learning the hard way. This happened many years ago, when I was about 10 or 11 years old. I wouldn't describe the area I was in as backwoods necessarily, but it was a wooded 100+ acre ranch. The land is in the southwest part of the United States. My family owns the property, and we have family reunions every year and all stay for about 5 days to camp. There's an area of the ranch where we all set up camp and cook and eat. Getting to that part of the ranch requires driving through a small village and several gates for about 2 miles. The first gate beyond the village is slightly past a set of railroad tracks. That's a lot of description, but it's relevant later in the story. Because I had been camping at the ranch for as long as I could remember and the land was private, my parents would allow me to go off on my own during the day as long as I didn't go too far. I'd spend time walking the property near our camp area looking for arrowheads or trying to catch tadpoles in the ponds. On this day, I left the large camp area after lunch, which was around 11:30, and told my mom I was going to a nearby creek. I planned on catching some tadpoles to bring back to camp and be back on time for a swimming trip my cousins were planning. They wanted to go to a nearby river, and I really didn't want to miss it. I made it down to the creek and got several tadpoles. I probably spent a total of 15 minutes down there. To get back to camp, I would have needed to either climb up a relatively steep embankment with a lot of loose rock or circle around on a longer route with a flat trail. I'd usually go up the embankment, but I didn't have a top for the water bottle I caught the tadpoles with and didn't want to risk slipping and spilling them out or killing them. I had never walked the longer trail by myself, but I had with my dad and felt confident I could find my way back to camp on it. As I walked back to camp, I had my head down, looking for arrowheads in the washed out areas of the trail. I started feeling a little creeped out as I continued walking. We all know that feeling like someone is watching. It was unsettling, but I chalked it up to just getting spooked being on the trail by myself. Now for the next part, I can't explain whatsoever. It's as if a light switch was turned on or someone snapped their fingers, and I came back to reality. Except when I came, I wasn't on the trail I had been on before. I was near the railroad tracks, and it was completely dark. My mom was standing in front of me, shaking my shoulders and yelling, "Where were you?" 2 things I remember really clearly about the moments I came to are, 1, the look of fear, anger, or relief in my mom's tearful eyes as she was yelling at me, and 2, the confusion I felt about what the hell was going on. The last thing I remembered was walking on the trail back to camp, and now suddenly it was dark and I was at the railroad tracks leading to the ranch, which was over 2 miles away. The best way I can describe it is to compare it to the movie The Butterfly Effect. The main character would be living in one moment, then suddenly he'd wake up somewhere entirely different. My parents drove me back to camp, and I learned it was 10:30 p.m. This meant I had been gone for 11 hours, about 10.5 of which I can't account for to this day. My parents and all my family had understandably freaked the hell out when I hadn't returned to camp. They had been looking for me all day. I was a really good kid growing up and almost never broke any rules, so my parents were baffled at my behavior. I tried to explain to them that I had no memory of getting to the tracks, but they didn't believe me. They thought maybe I got lost and were embarrassed to admit it. This was the only time I've ever experienced something like this. I can't explain how unsettling it is to not be able to account for all those hours I was gone. Was it a coincidence that I had that creeped out feeling on the trail and then just lost 10.5 hours of my life? I wish I had answers for what happened. Has anyone had anything similar happen? I was sleeping in a remote cottage on the shores of Loch Arkaig. Outside was a monstrous storm, and I was huddled around a small fireplace while all my clothes steamed nearby. At around 3:30 a.m., I heard someone outside. Then the door burst open, and a tall, thin Glaswegian man walked in with a World War I greatcoat on. He had wild, staring eyes and grunted a few words. He hunched by the fire, whereupon he pulled out of his pocket a big lump of raw mince and took a few large bites. He then stood up again and left. The whole encounter lasted 10 minutes. 1. So we're hiking up the trail, or down depending on how you look at it, 'cause we're going south but we're going uphill. And we notice these headstones along the sides of the trail, which ain't surprising. The trail is known to go by or through some old graveyards. And as we're going up this hill we notice an organdy light at the top of the hill. Now we had our headlamps on at this point 'cause it had started to rain a little, so the bugs had died down, so at first we thought it was a road reflector or something placed for the cemetery. Then it moved. And it came running down the hill at us. We pulled our knives and kinda slid to the nearest headstone thinking maybe it was a boar, and hooped and hollered at it trying to scare it off, but it kept coming. Then about 50 feet shy of us it hooks a 90 degrees right turn through the headstones and goes blank. Like it stops shining at all. And we hear it breathing now where we didn't before. Sounds out of breath. We follow it with our lights and out from behind the far headstone pops this monster coyote. Thing was the size of a German shepherd. Would have thought it was a wolf other than where we were. It runs about 20 from the headstone to the woodline like we're not even there, then turns around and sits down and watches us. We decided that even if we could take a coyote, having already hiked 22 miles that day, we didn't really want to and got out of there fast. Thing was ducking freaky as hell. And I thought back to the reason we were night hiking to begin with, which was when we went to camp earlier that night. I just got these putrid vibes from the campsite and shelter. Like just, made me want to run for my life from the place. I begged my hiking partner to hike on to make it to the end, cause I knew that unless we climbed the nearby fire tower or something and slept up there I wasn't gonna sleep that night. So we decided to push through. Then that shit happened. I swear to this day we ran into a duck and skinwalker. But beyond that we were basically just hiking through darkness by moonlight. The bugs were ducking oppressive, and if we ran out headlamps they swarmed our face, 17 miles through the backwoods in the middle of nowhere. And the trail just happened to go through or around about a dozen cemeteries. Spooky as shit. 2. We rock into the campsite for a caving convention late one night and throw up our tent in one of the only available spots down by the creek. It's pouring rain. Get the tent up, go inside, and eat a dinner of cold cuts before we peel off our wet clothes and curl up in our sleeping bags to get warm. At 3 a.m., someone's pounding on our tent door and shouting. Get up and open the flap, and this guy tells us the creeks are flash flooding and it's blocked. We need to move. Step out and realize it's already licking at our coolers and canopy, and it's about 2 feet from our tent. Grounds are saturated, but we've got an old model Chevy 4-wheel drive, so no fear there. Rip the tent up, throw everything in the truck, take it all to higher ground, and go back to start helping others. I don't think anyone got sleep till daybreak, and a few folks were trapped on the other side of the creek at some more isolated spots for, I think, 4 or 5 days after that. The only reason we got woken up was because there was a late night cave trip that had just got back after running for their lives out of a flooding cave, according to what I was told. The storm had changed course and overproduced. I dumped like 15 inches that night. On the second night of my solo trip in the Never Summer Range in CO, I was awakened by a loud mechanical noise. Assuming it was an exceptionally noisy truck making its way over the pass nearby, I did my best to ignore it. But it didn't stop, and it kept getting louder. Since I was now wide awake, I figured I'd get up to pee, and when I was outside of the tent, I noticed a large black void in the sky. These skies are packed with stars on a clear night, as the area is next to a national park and there are no city lights nearby. I could very clearly see the outline of a diamond-shaped object, very, slowly moving across the sky. The mechanical noise was reverberating through the valley, seemingly coming from all directions. I didn't see or hear any other campers get up or stir at all. It was just me in the dark staring up at this thing until it eventually passed behind a mountain and the noise subsided. I wouldn't call the experience scary, it was just strange. I've never had anything like it before or since. I'm 16. I live in southeast McCurtain County, Oklahoma. I was born and raised here all my life. I've been hunting these woods ever since I can remember, and every now and again I always catch a glimpse of something that is out roaming in the woods out here. When I was around 4 or 5, I was playing in the living room of my house, and it was around 11:30 to 12 p.m., and from the other side of the house, my mom was telling me, "Go to bed, it's late." After she said that, I got up and started walking to my room. The layout of my house is that the front door has a glass screen door and a main door, and the living room and my room are right by each other down the hallway, and the front door has a little 8-foot hallway too, so pretty much my bedroom and the front door are right next to each other. So when I was leaving the living room and stared, I walked down the hall to go to my room. I stopped in front of my front door because I felt like something was looking at me, so I slowly turned my head to the right towards the front door. We always keep the main door shut and locked at night, but that night it wasn't. What I saw at the front door still haunts me to this day. There was this big creature standing in front of the screen door, looking in and staring at me. This thing was massive and covered head to toe except for its face with dark brown hair, its shoulders were wider than the frame of the door, and it was crouched over with its hands besides its knees. Me and this thing locked eyes for a good 5 seconds. I could see this thing blinking, its nostrils were flaring up and making steam on the glass of the screen door. I was frozen with fear. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there and stared at this huge thing in my doorway. After a few seconds of staring at each other, the creature flinched its whole body. The reason why it did, right after this thing did that, my body took over, and I ran to my room, locked the door, and was hidden underneath the covers of my bed. That's all I remember from that night, but after that day, I would still be seeing things out in the woods and crossing roads to this day. My most recent encounter was in late May of this year with my girlfriend and her little sister. My girlfriend was staying at her grandpa's house, and I was coming over to stay a little while. When I got there, it was a few minutes before the sun started going down, and my girlfriend and her little sister were out near the edge of her grandpa's front yard. They were standing next to the fire pit that they had, and they were about to start a fire in the pit. After a few minutes of trying to start this fire, the wood and sticks that my girlfriend and her sister brought to start the fire with were too rotten and wet, so we just sat outside in the chairs they had around the fire pit. After a few minutes of sitting there, the sun had already gone down, and it was dark. My girlfriend and her sister were just talking, and my girlfriend's little sister started to whistle. I'm Choctaw/Native American, and one of the things I've always been told is to never whistle at night. It's bad luck or a monster will come out of the woods and get you. Right when I heard her whistling, I automatically told her to stop. I told her that it was bad luck and that something would come to her if she continued to whistle. Of course, my 9-year-old sister didn't care, so she kept on whistling. When she wouldn't stop whistling, I told my girlfriend that I started to have a weird feeling that something didn't feel right, and a few seconds later, I told her that she heard what sounded like a stick breaking in the pasture near the tree line that was about 150 yards behind us. She got up and walked over to the fence to see if she could find out what made that sound. I got up and walked over there to her and asked her, "What's up?" She told me that she thought she heard a stick break and was trying to see what it was, so I pulled my phone out and shined my light to see if we could see anything. After about a minute of looking into the pasture, we didn't see anything, so we started to brush it off and were going to sit back down by the fire pit. Right when we turned around to go back to the fire pit, all of us heard a stick break, and it sounded really close, so we all looked in the pasture again. My girlfriend stood on the fence to get a better look, and she saw something and pointed and asked me, "Do you see that black thing standing in front of the trees?" I looked where she pointed. There was a big, black figure a few yards in front of the trees, less than 100 yards in front of us, and it appeared to be walking towards us. My girlfriend started to freak out and started running to the house. I grabbed her little sister and ran to the house too. We both got into the house and locked every door in the house, and we were just looking at each other like, did we just see what we thought we saw? A little while later, I drove back home. I haven't seen anything else like that again. I've got a couple. I live in East Texas, right in the big thicket. There are lots of trees, especially pine trees, and swamps, depending on how close you get to Louisiana. The first mystery is Bigfoot sightings. One case that sticks out for me is a couple that were attacked by some kind of animal, about 7 feet tall with black hair. They said it looked kind of like an ape or a man. Well, technically, it attacked their car. Left claw marks in the hood. We've actually had some confirmed black bear sightings here, and the description of their encounter sounds just like videos I've seen of bears attacking cars, so I think our Bigfoot is really just bears. They are very rare here, so it makes sense that someone in this area wouldn't be able to identify them, especially since it happened at night. Though I do like the idea of an undiscovered ape species living out there. The other one is our ghost light. There's a road, Bragg Road, where people go to look for them. This is actually where that Bigfoot attack happened. Basically, there's these weird balls of light that show up at night. Some people say it's swamp gas or just car tail lights way down the road, but people have had close-up encounters too. Specifically, the lights chase cars and then make a sharp turn back into the trees after a little while. Or they fly up to people super fast and just disappear. I've personally experienced both of those, far-off lights that never get any closer or farther, no matter how long you follow, and lights that come up close, like close enough to touch if you could. I have no idea what they are, but I think it's a natural phenomenon that we just don't understand yet. Like, maybe some kind of electricity? I read in one theory that the Bigfoot is some sort of magical ape that uses hypnosis to confuse people or something, and that the lights are caused by them. It's pretty far out, but it's the most fun explanation, so I like it. I was cycling through Normandy, and I couldn't find anywhere suitable to camp, so I pitched up on a small bit of woodland with no trespassing signs, but duck it, there's no fence, there's a nice clearing, I'm exhausted, and it's almost nightfall. I'll be quick, I'll be quiet, and I'll leave before sunrise. So I set up camp, cooked myself some dinner, and settled in for the night. About 4:30, I wake up to the sound of rustling and sniffing near where I set up my stove and sticks breaking underfoot about 30 meters away. So I draw the conclusion that there's a dog sniffing my camp and an angry French landowner with a shotgun approaching. I prepare myself and my best broken French phrase off, "Sorry sir, I'll bugger off straight away," as I sit up and unzip the tent, expecting to be confronted by a barking dog, a shotgun, and an angry, incomprehensible French farmer. A scary situation to be in. However, as I stick my head out of the tent while saying bonjour in a loud, firm, yet reassuring manner, I find myself face to face with a sinister, dark, hairy creature that, in the half-light of pre-dawn, looks exactly like a European wolf to my sleep-deprived, panicked monkey brain, causing me to freeze in fear. Thankfully, the creature in question and its companion about 20 meters away were also scared by this unexpected encounter, but they chose to squeal and flee at an incredible speed, which, after a few seconds, I realized meant that they were wild boar. At which point, I got really scared. I returned to my sleeping bag and lay awake for half an hour until I was sure they were gone and it was light enough to pack up my stuff, then promptly got the duck out of there. So although I'm super late to this, I'll still share my story. I was 13 at my grandfather's hunting camp. My uncle had just bought a new hunting camera and wanted to test it out, so he set it up out in the woods. I got the brilliant idea to go up in the woods with my 2 other cousins and moon it, so when he checked the card, instead of wildlife, he would have seen some cheeks. Hilarious to a 13-year-old's mind, and after some convincing, my other 2 cousins were in, but we had to go under the cover of darkness. So we set our alarms for 3 a.m. and passed out. By 3:15, we all sneak outside, throw on our headlamps, and start walking. We know the camera is about a mile away. The trail goes over 2 pretty big hills, and the camera is in a valley on the far side of the second hill. We start walking as normal, and everything is good. The excitement starts building, and we're pretty giddy that we are pulling this glorious prank. After a few minutes of brisk walking, we get to the top of the second hill. My older cousin, who knows the area better than me, stops as he gets to the top. As I make my way to the top, I see why. Off in the distance, about 400 yards, is a spotlight. Its bluish/white color illuminates nearly half of the hill it's pointed at. This thing was crazy bright. By this time, all 3 of us were looking at the light, and my older cousin told us to turn off our headlamps. We stand there in silence. Me, being the 13-year-old pussycat I was, started to get freaked out. Aliens are the first thing that comes to mind, and I tell him we have to leave. I turn on my headlamp and turn around, about to head back to the campsite. As soon as I turn my light back on, the super bright blue light starts to slowly turn and stops right on us. No bobbing or movement from the light, besides, just a slow motion does not pan right over to us. At this point, I nope the duck out, with my cousins right behind. I get inside and go straight to bed, pretty much freaking out. Flash forward to next morning, all 3 of us go back to the same spot and then proceed to go to where we thought the light would have been, and there was nothing there. No boot marks, no light, no nothing. To this day, I still have no idea. This is 100% truth, and I'd take any lie detector test that was sent my way. There is more to it than that. We lived in a house that had an outhouse. There is no indoor toilet. We had running water but just couldn't get a proper septic system in there. The outhouse was up the hill a ways, about 30 yards. This was in a valley, and the nearest neighbor was roughly 4 miles away. Good luck if you need an emergency service. We had 3 dogs, the biggest of all was a lab mix named Boo Bear. Boo was a very loyal and territorial dog. It didn't matter what time of day it was, he'd go with you up to the outhouse and sit outside. This was normal behavior for years. I'm getting goosebumps thinking about him and welling up with tears, man. He was a damn good dog. One night, my mom needed to go, and he went with her. We'd normally just walk up and do our business, then head back and go back to sleep. We had no AC, just windows and fans. Boo followed Mom up there, and this time he was between Mom and the woods. There was a solid tree line around the house that you couldn't see into at all. I've hunted it, but I'd get my ass back to the house before it got even close to dark. Boo felt or heard something. The more my mom tried to get up, the more he was growling. He had never behaved this way. My mom, a devout Baptist, swears on the Bible that she heard what sounded like grunting coming out of the woods. She could feel something either stomping or punching the ground. Punch a thought of flour, it's got that thought, that's what she described it as. My mom was raised by some serious hillbillies and isn't scared of anything in the woods, so she forced her way up there. She thought it was a deer, as they'll do that in rut season. Boo sat out there growling, and she said every hair he had on him was standing up straight. He wasn't barking, she could feel his growling, like I don't know how to describe it, like you feel bass from a subwoofer. She got done and came back to the house. There were no other issues that night. A few nights later, a friend was staying at my house. He was one of the ones that was with me when we saw whatever it was that we saw. This was actually prior to this by a year or 2. He grew up poor like us, but he was a good dude, His mom and dad were great. Anyway, it's about 11 or 11:30, it was Friday or Saturday because we had a 10 p.m. bedtime on weeknights and we were playing Killer Instinct on N64. Man, when I said this, it scared me. I thought my mom was being killed. We heard a scream and felt a noise come from the woods about 150 yards up that mountain. Buddy, I have goosebumps coming up like crazy right now. I didn't say shit, I kept playing, thinking that my brain was playing tricks on me. 5 minutes later, it happened again. This time it was maybe 75 to 100 years up and it was heading down. I stopped and asked RG if he heard that, and he said, "Duck, yeah, I heard it the first goddamn time too." Man, I can describe it. A fight or flight kicked in, and we were in a panic. I checked on my mom and my little brother, and both were fine. I woke my little brother up and told him what was going on, and we grabbed our rifles. I only had a 30-06, RG had my 20 gauge, and Pound, my little brother, had a.22. We parked our asses in the room we were in when we first heard it. When I say my heart was racing, if it were doing the 100-meter dash, it'd have beat Usain Bolt. We didn't hear anything for 30 minutes. Just nothing. We had the windows open due to no AC, and we had the fans off. We started hearing a noise coming from the woods. Just walking. It sounded like something was slowly plodding down the ridge to the house. I know it was no cat. You will never hear a big cat. I've had cougars surprise me, and I never heard a thing. This was big. It was making a lot of racket. We just kept sitting there, ears alert. Scream again. This one shook our windows, literally. Everything shook. There was nothing we could have done at that point. It was within 25 yards of our house, and we were petrified. Boo was just pacing back and forth. He wanted to get out. I didn't want him to go, and neither did Pound or RG. He was our safety blanket in that moment. We decided to just hang out in there, and we started hearing the grunting. All I can say is that I've heard deer and rut. This was way too guttural. This freaking feeling of dread came over all of us. We all started bawling. We really felt like we were going to die. Mom finally woke up and came in there. She saw us all holding our guns, and she was like, "What are you all doing?" I put my hand up to my face, she saw we were crying, and I put my index finger to my mouth too. Shh. The grunting kept going. Louder and louder. Then the pounding started. It wasn't hitting a tree or anything, it was hitting the ground. Like punching the shit out of it. We could feel each hit. Mom said this was what she had heard the other night, but that she didn't think much of it. Duck me, man. This SHT seriously scarred me. The grunting and pounding stopped. Mom decided to send Boo out. Nikki and Bella, our other dogs, didn't do shit. Boo was just a badass, and we were his family. He beelined it up there. That was it. We heard one yelp and nothing. We didn't hear anything else that night. For several days, it was that way. Boo was gone, and we were all shook up. I think it was 5 or 6 days later that my stepdad went to use the outhouse, and laying next to the building was Boo. I swear for my life that this dog was literally torn apart. There were no bite marks, it wasn't a cat. He had literally been ripped apart, limb from limb. I don't know what it was. It could have been a bear, I don't know. I know that we moved out of there a month later, and that damned place can't keep people in it anymore. I can't say that I smelled anything or anything like that. The outhouse smelled pretty damn gnarly. It was definitely one of the worst experiences of my life. I was hiking in the foothills of the Andes in Bolivia, above the town of Sorda. I was lost, but just mildly lost. I knew how to get back to civilization pretty quickly, just go down, but I was trying to get to a lake high up in the mountains, and I'd lost the trail I was supposed to be on. Earlier that day, while walking along the trail, one of the locals joined me. He seemed friendly, but his English was really bad, and my Spanish was even worse. But we chatted for a bit. One of the things he said to me was that he could push me off a cliff and steal my stuff, and no one would ever know. I just pretended I couldn't understand what he said. So this made me a bit uneasy. Now it was later in the day, he was long gone, and I was lost, which made me even more uneasy. The fog came in, and visibility dropped to tens of meters. I continued walking along the trail. And then I could sense something watching me. It was really weird. I didn't see it at first, I just sensed it. So I looked more carefully, and there was a large shape in the fog, larger than a human, and it was watching me. As I got closer, I saw that it was a horse standing facing me, so I couldn't see its profile. I continued a bit further and set up camp. The next day was gloriously sunny. I eventually figured out where I was and how to get to the trail I wanted to be on. I had to get down a cliff, and I found a secret trail that led me down the cliff. I eventually got to the lake, It was spectacular. On the way back down, I ended up sleeping in the entryway of an old abandoned mine because it was the only flat ground I could find. Overall, it was a truly spectacular hike. But being lost, hiking through the fog, and being watched by a large creature I couldn't identify was a bit unsettling. My partner and I are avid hikers. Last July, we went on a trip and decided to camp at this spot we love, just west of Shenandoah. It's quiet, off the beaten path, and offers absolutely spectacular views of both Shenandoah and portions of the George Washington National Forest to the west. The first day and evening of the trip itself were nice and uneventful, though we didn't sleep super well because of the humidity. The next morning, we decided to go for a hike in a portion of Jefferson Forest we'd never been to before. It's comprised of ATV trails and about a dozen campsites, but has a trail that leads to an old fire tower we'd always wanted to check out. It was about a 45-minute drive from our campsite, mostly on back roads. When we got there, the first thing that stuck out to us was how empty the campsites were. We actually didn't camp there the night before because we'd heard that the site is usually packed, and we knew we wouldn't arrive early enough on the weekend to get a spot. There were only 2 spots taken. In one were a desiccated tent and a bunch of garbage. It looked like someone had been there for a while, but it was deserted when we arrived. On the other hand, there was a young woman, I'm guessing in her late teens, setting up a small backpacking tent. There was a truck and one other smaller car in the parking area. We parked and started getting our gear together, and the woman approached us to ask if we knew where the trailhead was. I told her that we'd read that it branched off about 100 yards into one of the ATV tracks, but we weren't 100% sure which. Since I was getting such weird vibes from the place, I kind of hoped she'd stick around and go with us to find it, but she just thanked us and took off in the general direction of the trail. We set off and walked up and down a few of the ATV trails until we found the walking path. We saw 2 ATVs shoot by us at one point but otherwise didn't encounter anyone else, including the woman from earlier. It took us about an hour to get to the top of the mountain, where the fire tower was. It's an old metal structure, and you have to climb a narrow set of stairs to get to the top of it. We got up, looked around, took some pictures, and started heading down. Honestly, the view was kind of a letdown. About halfway down, very suddenly, everything stopped, the birds, the bugs, it was dead silent. And I don't know quite how to put this into words, but it felt like the ancientness of the forest was contorting and crushing us. I felt trapped and cornered in spite of the expanse around us. My partner and I looked at each other and wordlessly started to book it out of there. We started running back to the car, but the feeling only followed us. As we were rounding one of the switchbacks, we heard this unearthly shriek, like a cross between metal on metal and a choir screaming off key. And we saw something. I just got a glimpse of it before we blacked out. I don't know how to describe it other than that it looked huge despite clearly not taking up much physical space and moving in writhes and flashes. It didn't have a color, it just felt like evil and emptiness. I probably only perceived it for half a second before my memory just completely gave way. When we came, we were sitting in the car, and 2 hours had passed, double the length of time it took us to get up there. I don't know if I lost consciousness or just somehow blocked those hours out. I learned later that the exact same thing had happened to my partner. Both of the cars were next to us in the parking lot, and there were still just the 2 tents at the campsite. The woman wasn't in hers, and it looked exactly the same as she'd left it. I think about her all the time and have spent a ton of time trying to figure out if someone went missing around the time of our trip. It took a few months for my partner and I to talk about that day. We still love to hike but honestly haven't been able to in Appalachian forests since this happened. I'm curious if others have had other experiences like this. I grew up in Vietnam. My family is very affluent, so we had just 10 acres of land all to ourselves. No one else really lived here except a house here and there. Our closest neighbors were 3 miles away. Our territory wasn't gated except for a smallish brick wall, and we had a ton of street dogs that we adopted that kind of roamed around. I was under strict instructions to never go anywhere past these certain trees that were marked, and once the sunset started, I couldn't go past the West Territory. Now, I want to say that in Vietnam, people are very superstitious. It is not so much whether you believe in ghosts, spirits, or the paranormal or not, but whether they can harm you. Whenever I walked past these trees, the dogs would furiously bark, and a few would drag me back by my shirt or even go bark at my family's workers and kind of tell on me. I always assumed that it was because I was very young, so they didn't want me to wander off and get lost. When I was 13, I became more and more interested. My family went to a funeral while the workers still worked, and my grandmother watched me. My grandmother was a very old woman, and I was a very sneaky child. I obviously snuck off, and while I was wandering through the woods, I explored and saw pythons, lizards, water monitors, and monkeys. Here's the weird thing. I felt like the whole time, these animals were kind of leading me to something, if that makes sense. I distinctly remember that the first animal that I saw was a huge dragonfly. It led me past the marked trees on the east side of my territory, and then I saw a frog that had a really weird texture to it, a very rough kind of lizard-like thing. I felt like I was in a trance-like state, and an animal transformed into another animal, and I began to come to the realization that these weren't different animals but the same one transforming. I didn't see it transform, but it could be a monitor lizard, and then it would go past a rock, and the next animal would be a huge python. I should also mention that all my dogs, we had about 20 of them at that time, were fiercely protective of me and trailed me like shadows. All the workers always said that wherever I walked, a horde of dogs would follow, and when I slept at night, they all slept directly outside my window. However, less and less dogs followed me as I got deeper into the woods. By the time I saw the lizard monitor, I'm pretty sure only a handful were still me. Most stayed back after the first few trees. I realized it was getting really dark, but the sky looked weird for some reason. I stopped following the animal, which was a monkey at this point, and just turned back. Getting back was a lot more difficult than getting there. When I was following the creature, I felt like the woods were just kind of opening up a trail for me. Like I didn't trip on any shrubs or vines, and nothing really blocked my way. On the way back, I was convinced the woods had completely changed. I wasn't really scared, just a little cold since I believed I didn't even wander off that far. Eventually, I heard some dogs barking and followed, and I could see my house. Everyone was frantic when I came back. They had about 100 people searching for me, family and our workers, and a few more people, like an extended family of workers, owed favors to my family. Apparently, I had been missing for 3 days, and the husband of one of my aunt's workers went in after me, and he's been missing since then. I got really scared and told my family what happened, and they were white in the face. We drove to a very popular Buddhist temple, and we got blessed, and the monks told my family what they believed happened while I was sitting outside eavesdropping with my older cousin. Our family has a problem with people going missing. My grandmother's brother said he felt like he was being guided with a hand on his back, and he was stuck between 2 rocks. His old black dog found him, which is a common belief in Vietnam that all black dogs are very powerful and can scare spirits away, which explains why my uncle always picked all black dogs. My grandma's first son was playing in a creek while she traveled a little more downstream to do laundry, and she said it seemed like someone pushed him in and held his head down, and as she tried to run to him, something in the water wrapped around her foot. A villager nearby ran down to save him. The monks gave me a Buddha necklace they blessed, and I still wear that necklace today. The man that went missing who was looking for me was never found, although my mom told me they did. I believe my aunt paid the wife a large sum of money, bought them a house far away, and still sends money regularly. A few days after this, the workers started chopping down trees, a fence was built around the east side of our territory, and we started a karaoke bar that now resides there. What do I believe happened? I have many theories, but I think the spirits are upset that my grandmother came onto their land and built over it. Before my family cut down trees and built our house there, no one lived there. I think they were upset that we were disturbing their peace and quiet. I still don't like going hiking on this day. When I do, it's never a very far hike, and I don't let my dog off leash because I'm terrified. Cutting firewood in the mountains of central Idaho. In many rural areas of the American West, cutting firewood in national forests is a necessary chore if you want a warm house through the winter. Our home in mountainous central Idaho was no exception. It was normal for my dad to pick me and my brothers up after school and head into the mountains for an afternoon of firewood gathering. My dad would fell the dead trees, then saw them into chunks. My brothers and I had the task of rolling the wood to the truck and loading it. We would continue this assembly line process until we had a truckload of wood, usually before nightfall. Hot, sweaty, and exhausted, we would pile into the truck cab and make our way down the mountain. At home the next day, we would unload and split the wood and stack it into neat little rows. This process was repeated until we had a winter's worth of fuel for our house, our grandma's cabin, and any extra for elderly neighbors. This particular afternoon, we decided to try a different logging road on the other side of the valley. This was well outside our familiar logging area. There was no real reason for the change, but my dad said he wanted a change of scenery. This logging road hadn't been maintained in some time. Large rocks and fallen branches littered the path. My brothers and I had to walk out in front, pushing rocks and wood out of the way as my dad lurched the truck up the switchbacks. Yard by yard, we slowly made our way up the mountain. That hike was physically brutal. As we ascended the mountain and got farther into the trees, this odd feeling started to set in. I wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion from the hike or something more. There was electricity in the air. Like the whole mountain was buzzing at a wavelength just below my senses. In some odd way, it felt like the mountain knew we were there, and it wasn't welcomed by that fact. I wanted to say something to my brothers, but before I opened my mouth, my younger brother said, "Does anyone else feel like we're not welcome here?" My older brother and I stopped in our tracks and looked back at him. Both of us nodded in agreement. This moment was broken by my dad honking and motioning for us to continue clearing the path. Reluctantly, we pushed forward to a small clearing in the woods, where we finally stopped the truck. My dad, oblivious to our apprehension, or simply choosing to ignore it, grabbed his saw and went to work. As the wood was felled and loaded, I couldn't shake this ominous feeling enveloping me like a dark shroud. I noticed my brothers were taking occasional glances over their shoulders as we worked. Everyone but my dad, it seemed, was on edge. The sun nestled down into the trees, and twilight began to set in. As the light drained from the sky, my anxiety only intensified. It wasn't until my dad unexpectedly told us to load up that a wave of relief flooded over me. I could see the tension between my brothers melt away as well. The truck wasn't fully loaded. An oddity. Getting a half load was a waste, according to my dad. We would sometimes work in the dark just to make sure the truck was full. But tonight, he seemed eager to head home. With everything loaded, we started down the road. Although dead tired, everyone seemed to be in a much lighter mood. We were chatting and cracking jokes while trying to blow off steam from the afternoon. We were almost out of the tree line and into the valley desert. Going down the switchbacks, you want to be careful, especially with a load, even if it was half that. A brown blur jumped up from the downslope side of the switchback. "Shit," was the only word that came out of my dad's mouth as he slammed on the brakes. Loaded with wood and traveling downhill, there was no way to avoid smashing into the blur. The truck finally ground to a standstill. The four of us peered through the windshield. Nobody is saying a word. Illuminated in the yellow glow of our headlights was a crumpled body of deer. Grumbling and cursing the deer's existence, my dad exited the truck to investigate. Doing as they were told, my brothers stayed put in the truck. I didn't listen. Following close behind my dad. The truck was fine. We hadn't been traveling fast when we smacked the deer. Just some hair and blood on the grill guard. Hitting a deer really wasn't that unusual. The mountains were full of them. What was unusual was that the deer dropped so quickly. At faster speeds, deer could still be upright and sprinting away to die in the woods after a collision. That last burst of adrenaline. This one fell over like a rag doll. Before even approaching the carcass, a deep, foul smell hit us. Deer smell bad when they're alive, but this was on a whole other level. It was the smell of decay and rot. My stomach began to turn as we got closer. My nostrils were burning. Coming up on the deer, it was clearly dead. Really, really dead. The stench was so overwhelming, my eyes were watering. The body was a true horror scene. The deer's eyes were gone, replaced with a sunken, hollow hole. As if to overcompensate for their absence, the tongue was swollen and black as coal. It could not be contained and hung out the side of its mouth. The underbelly was split open. Entrails and offal spilled into the dirt. In the dim headlights, it looked as though the deer's fur and viscera were moving. Wiggling almost. Holding my breath, I bent down for a closer look, and my heart stopped. The deer, inside and out, was covered in maggots. It was dead, all right, but our truck didn't kill it. Clearly, it had been dead for days, if not weeks. I backed away, retching. That electric anxiety came screaming back. My dad was always the quiet, stoic type, but right now, even in the dim headlights of the truck, I could see the abject horror in his face. His gaze wasn't on the deer but focused down the mountain. Poorly masking the fear in his voice, he told me firmly to walk back to the truck and get inside. I obeyed without objection. As I grabbed the door handle, a loud shriek came out of the trees. Branches were shattering and breaking. Something was heading up the slope towards us. I slammed my door closed just as my dad reached the truck. Before his door was shut, he pressed on the accelerator. The truck launched forward, sending us over the deer carcass and racing down the hill. With mine and my brothers yelling, it was hard to tell if the shrieking was following us. Our truck popped out of the tree line and into the desert sagebrush. Once out of the woods, everything quieted down. We were left with only the rumble of the engine and the wind through the half-open windows. Pulling into our property, the truck came to a stop. We sat in silence. No one moved to leave the truck. Everyone started talking at once. We all had questions. What was the screaming? How does a dead deer jump uphill in front of a truck? There was no way the truck killed it. Dad just shook his head and motioned for us to quiet down. That deer was dead when we hit it. It didn't jump out in front of us. It was thrown at us. We stared at him. He explained that all day up on the mountain, he had felt uneasy. Not wanting to worry us boys, he kept it to himself. He described it as walking into a stranger's living room while they were upstairs, asleep. That feeling never left him, and as twilight came, he happened to catch a shadow in the corner of his eye. I was not far into the woods when I saw figures moving from tree to tree. He couldn't focus on them long enough for a good look before they dodged behind trees. His stomach dropped. Working hard to keep his composure, he hurried us to the truck to leave. It was after hitting the deer and discovering it was long dead that my dad pieced together what was happening. Something threw that deer to get us to stop. Before the shrieking began, he could hear something moving in the darkness beyond the road. It was a trap. Running back to the truck could have started an ambush or triggered a prey drive, so we walked back to the truck. The second we were inside, he drove that truck downhill with no intention of stopping for anyone or anything. That feeling of electricity didn't disappear until we hit the county highway. My brothers and I never saw anything as we drove away. But those screams from the forest will never leave my mind. We didn't gather firewood for the rest of the season. For the first time in his life, my dad just bought what we needed. And although we started to gather wood again the next season, we've never been back up that particular mountain. The Forest Service has permanently closed and reclaimed that road. The only way back up into those woods is a long hike. One I'm not interested in ever taking again. Whatever was on that mountain, whatever threw that deer carcass, whatever chased us out of the woods, it did not want us there, it wanted us gone. Or worse, it wanted us dead. You know those tales about staying out of the woods at night? What follows is a true story that happened in the southern UK. Sometimes, experiences can only be described as falling outside the realms of normality, and it's like you're being given a glimpse into another world. We had some time to kill between running errands one evening, so we headed up to a high spot overlooking the forest while we waited. It was a couple of hours after sunset, and we hoped to see some wildlife that would normally get scared off during daylight. There were roadblocks on some of the lanes because of tree felling, so, apart from us, the parking lot was completely deserted, and this viewpoint was just ours for tonight. It's next to an old holloway, a prehistoric trackway, and the area is littered with ancient burial mounds and the remains of occupation from the Iron Age, Roman, and Saxon times. This place is old. We stopped the van and stepped out, taking in the view ahead of us. Grassy downland sloped gently towards the forest's edge at the bottom of the hill, where weak moonlight bounced off a layer of low-lying mist. Ahead, the whole woods were laid out for us to see, a large expanse of dark forest with jagged treetops visible against the slightly lighter skyline. My husband, A, had brought a high-powered torch to shine into the edges of the woods to see if any eyes lit up from the wildlife. It's always amazing to shine a light into darkness and see the eyes of rabbits, deer, or hares shining back at you. Tonight, though, there was nothing, which is incredibly unusual. We could only hear distant tawny owls calling every now and again and see the occasional silent, dark shape glide in front of us. The place felt a little uneasy and watchful. Nearby on my left, there was an occasional creak of something rubbing, like a hanging sign being swayed by the wind. We know that patch inside out, and there's nothing there to make that noise. Besides, there wasn't even a breeze. I half joked about it being a ghostly gibbet, and actually, that's exactly what it did sound like. There are often strange things in the woods. You sort of learn not to question it too much and just accept things for what they are. I didn't really feel spooked, just a bit aware of it, particularly as the sound was centered at an ancient crossroads. Sitting in the van, we listened to the sounds of wildlife. Even the owls had quietened, and everything became still. We sat in the silence until, suddenly, a wind whipped up from behind us from out of nowhere through the trees. As soon as it started, it was gone. It felt odd, like something was passing through. Then, back to quiet. With our eyes tuned into the dark, we sat looking over the woodland. There was a strange noise to the right, like an animal calling, but nothing recognizable. The sound was followed by snapping branches. We know most woodland animal calls but have no idea what this was, so, we just kept cool about that too. Yes, we said. Probably just some kind of owl. He shone his torch in the direction of the sounds, only for it to go dead straight away. It had brand new batteries that evening and had been working perfectly when we first arrived. It's never failed before, or since, for that matter. So, the odd feeling stayed. There were a couple of dim lights on the horizon in the distance, and over to the right was a tiny section of faraway road with occasional glimpses of tiny headlights or the red of tail lights briefly showing. The main view ahead was literally just darkness. As we stared into the darkness, a small light came into view near the treetops. It looked reminiscent of a glowworm or an ember from a fire that persists into the night sky, only brighter. It moved in one direction, kind of higgledy-piggledy, and made its way slowly but with purpose. It started from nowhere in the woods, just appeared on the left within our field of view, and slowly moved to the right. Strangely, it appeared to be broadly following the route of an old trackway that only exists today in disjointed fragments of paths and telltale lines of trees marching through modern-day fields. The light followed the route smoothly for a while and then stopped. When it stopped, it seemed to glow brighter. It was unusual because it was constant and unobscured, not broken like it would be if it were carried by a walker, but high up like it was floating just above the treetops. The way it stayed constant made it seem certain it was a lot higher than the paths in the woods, or it would have been obscured by the trees. This was bright and close. It was within the area of the woodland, but not on the ground. It was staying in one spot now. As I stared at it, I began to realize that it looked as if it was moving in a different way, swaying. I doubted myself at first because there were so few points of reference against the black darkness of the trees. Were my eyes playing tricks? I looked at it a little closer. Minutes passed. No doubt about it, it was swaying. I saw A reach for his glasses and knew he was watching it too. We looked at each other. That's a bit weird. The movements looked strange, and I began to wonder more about the source of them, running through possibilities in my mind. I dismissed it as being attached to a building, and besides, in that direction, there are only farms much further away and on much lower ground. This was high, pretty much at the same level as us, parked up on the hill. Could it be a person carrying a torch? No. It simply wasn't moving in the right direction, and besides, it was unwaveringly pointing towards us. It didn't change angle or dim. It just didn't fit. We both agreed that it was swaying. A big, slow sway in a large arc of several meters at least. As we stared at it, it continued swaying from left to right to left, and left to right, like a pendulum. Rhythmic. It made no sense. Although the light looked very powerful, it wasn't illuminating anything at all. It itself was highly visible and impossible to miss, but it wasn't illuminating any branches surrounding it, a trunk below it, or any other trees around it. There was nothing showing but the light itself. It was a light that drew you in because it couldn't be explained away. Mesmerizing. We both know these woods really well, at all times of the day and night, on the paths and further off track. We know the terrain and the tall trees, Douglas firs, Scots pine, beech, and oaks. Even during the winter, the path can't be seen from where we were, but the treetops can. This light was definitely at tree canopy height, yet not suspended from the trees. As time went on, nothing changed. We watched it for nearly half an hour. The light just continued to sway and shine unabated until, eventually, time dictated that we needed to get back on our way. Switched on the engine, and the headlights were ready to move, and almost instantly, the light was extinguished. There was no dimming, no hesitation, it was simply on, and then it was off. Bizarre. It was as if the connection had been severed and the moment was over. We drove down the lane to the far end, following the edge of the woodland for nearly a mile, then turned around and drove back past where we'd been parked and on towards our destination. As we passed the trees, especially in the area of the parking lot, we looked for the light, but there was simply nothing at all. It's taken a couple of months to process and make sense of it, but the only explanation we can come to is that the light over the woods really was a will-o'-the-wisp.